Hey everyone, I wanted to give my thoughts on the new encounter support, Milio, who is coming out soon. I'm going to start by quickly talking about his spells. And so what his passive does is if any ability touches an ally, then their attacks or abilities are going to do more damage. So his Q, he kicks a fireball and it knocks back the first enemy hit, and then it bounces and explodes, doing magic damage and slowing in an area. Now I want to talk a little bit more about his Q. And so his Q is quite a long range. And if it hits a champion, it pushes them back and does that AoE slow. And this is actually interrupted by minions. And so if you're in bot lane and there is an enemy in the lane with you, you can't just Q through the wave to hit them. But you can try and push a minion into them. So if they're standing behind a minion, you can Q a minion, you can hit the minion, and you can make it bounce onto the enemy like that. So you can kind of use it as a little bit of a poking tool. But this is the only form of disengage in his kit, and so you would want to be careful throwing this out too much, because if you don't have your Q, you're probably going to be left stranded. It's also worth noting that the Q can pass through an ally and apply his passive. So in that sense, if you can throw a Q through an ally and hit an enemy and push him into another enemy, then that's going to get the most out of this spell. His W creates a zone which heals allies within its radius and also boosts attack range to allies. He can also recast his W to change the target to another ally. In terms of W, there's not too much to say about this ability. So it is a brand new mechanic in terms of increasing the attack range of allies within its radius. And the AoE heal, this is going to scale pretty well. You know, you want to group up with your teammates and you want to give them extra attack range and you want to heal them. In lane, this is not going to do much. The health restore is quite low. It is an exceptionally long cooldown. And so you'd want to get a bunch of points in this and build up a bunch of CDR and group up with your teammates to get the most of this. His E is pretty much like a Karma Shield, except that it has 2 stacks. And so it shields and provides a burst of move speed, and you can use it on yourself and another ally, or you can even use it twice on the same target, which will give a stacking effect. It gives more shield and more move speed for both instances. For his E, there's not much more to say. It just has a couple of charges, and so maybe you can get away from ganks or chase a little bit better. And then his ult heals in an AoE and removes any type of CC, including immobilizing effects, and also grants some tenacity for 3 seconds afterwards. If you're not versed many disabling or immobilizing effects, then the spell isn't going to do much, right? It does restore some health, but a lot of its power is going to be indexed in towards that cleansing mechanic. Similar to Janna's ult, if Janna's ult isn't actively knocking back the enemy engage and frontline away from your carries, then it's not going to feel as good. So on the one hand, a bunch of new mechanics are introduced with Milio in terms of increasing attack range of allies and being like a QSS, AoE QSS for your team. But on that same front, these are situational mechanics that are introduced, right? Not everyone is going to make use or as good a use as other champions with this bonus range, and this is not going to be effective versus most comps in the game. And so a lot of other content creators out there have already talked about how simple his kit is. I agree, it is a very simple kit. He only has 1 skill shot. And so based off of this, I would already put him in the same zone as like Yuumi or Sona, scaling enchanters that are very easy to play, or at least have a low skill floor. In lane, especially pre-6, he's just going to have no tools for wave control. He's going to have no trading power, really. His W is going to be pretty useless, and so he is going to be, in my opinion, very weak in the lane. Another reason that he is going to be weak in the early game is because he has such long base cooldowns that in laning phase, he has so few tools to work with, and he can't spam out any abilities. And inherently, he is going to scale better with stacking ability haste because he has those long cooldowns, and he's going to get more reduction in cooldown from them. So there are already some red flags in terms of playing this champion regularly in solo queue. I think he's going to be exceptionally weak early on, and he's going to be hard to blind. However, competitive league is going to be a different story. If he does get to survive the early lane and he gets to group up with his team and you are drafting champions around him and you are countering common meta picks. The main champions that are coming to mind now that are being played in pro play a lot, you know, Sejuani ult, Annie ult, you can cleanse those for your teammates. So to finish up my point about solo queue versus competitive, he's going to excel in very slow games and in certain compositions. He's going to struggle in chaotic paces of games. And so personally, I would be very hesitant to pick him in my own games. In Challenger, where games are decided very quickly. I would encourage you guys to pay attention to your games. Do your games typically feel like they're decided early on? Whichever team gets ahead early, they're just going to win the game? Or do your games feel like they're decided in the late game with team fights? Whoever gets to perform better than the enemy in that one big team fight, or whoever scales better. And even on that scaling front, I don't think he is going to be the best enchanter to pick for scaling. I think you can pick Sona, you can potentially pick Yuumi, you can potentially pick Lulu, even Renata. So a more situational pick in solo queue if you are comfortable in finding scaling. I want to talk about his Q a little bit more. I think his Q can be a counter to a lot of engage options because it is quite long range and it does knock back. And so any champ that engages forwards, this Q will cancel quite reliably. Kind of like a Renata Q, but even more reliably. So if you think about Leona E, if you think about even a Mumu Q, even Nautilus Q, Rel W, Alistair W, if you save your Q for these engages, then you can reliably survive and scale up. And some other enchanters are going to struggle to do this as reliably as Milio. So I think even more of an argument for him to be a situational counterpick versus hard CC and versus engaged champions. I want to give my thoughts on Milio's, potential synergies and counters. And so we haven't talked too much about W in terms of increasing the base attack range of his allies. Obviously, if your ally has longer range, then they're going to get more value out of this. And so the first champion that comes to mind is Caitlyn. Other champions that come to mind, Jinx and Twitch when they extend their range, potentially Kog'Maw as well. Although I do think most ADCs are going to enjoy this. I don't really know of an ADC that doesn't want to have longer attack range, just the amount that they get is going to be more significant on those champions that I mentioned. I also want to bring up Draven here, and this might sound a little bit strange. I think Draven could potentially shore up Milio's early lane weaknesses, and also his passive's damage scales with your ally's attack damage with that initial burst. And Draven loves stacking AD, so if you give him that extra range, and then he procs your passive with a lot of extra damage, I think this could be a cool interaction to consider. In terms of countering Milio, I think Pyke and Blitzcrank and Thresh are going to be very difficult for him to deal with. I also think he can get easily outscaled by some of those other enchanters I mentioned, like Sona, like Yuumi, like Lulu. And just in general, if your comp doesn't have any hard CC, then his ult is not going to give that much value. And so a lot of the time in solo queue, there are a lot of carries and assassins and upfront damage, which is not what his ult is going to be effective against. In terms of how you could potentially fit Milio into your champ pool, I think he should be primarily a situational pick when you see certain ADCs on your team, or when they have immobilizing effects that are hard countered by your ultimate, right? Otherwise, if you don't really have any scaling enchanters in your champion pool and you think Milio looks fun and he looks cool, then you can add him to be that scaling enchanter. Sometimes you're going to need some late game insurance in your champion pool, and this could be an option. This isn't something that I normally talk about, but I thought the champion looks really cool. His thematics make me want to play the champion. Fire-based male enchanter is something new and exciting. So that's something that's going for him. But anyway, the last point that I want to discuss is potential build ideas. And I don't think there's going to be anything too exciting on this front. I think you're probably going to want to consider either Aerie or Guardian. Aerie to scale better if you don't need the survivability. Guardian if you need that survivability in more hard engaged lanes. And just with a pretty standard Enchantress setup, I just don't think you would go for Scorch because he doesn't have any reliable poking tools. I also don't think you should consider Comet to poke with your Q because I don't think that's going to be his identity. You don't want to put too many points into his Q and his AP ratios are really bad. So I feel like you are kind of bottlenecked into being a scaling enchanter with Aerie for the most part. There might be a little bit of experimentation with the Glacial, just like there was with Renata on her Q. I do think Milio's Q is more reliable to hit with Glacial, but I have a feeling that you're probably going to get a lot of value out of Aerie and you're going to be able to proc it a lot, just sitting with your teammates pressing W, E, and R. And I don't imagine anything too exciting with itemization. It's probably going to be between Moonstone and Shurelya's for your Mythic and then standard enchanter items from there. I think Moonstone if the fights are long and drawn out, and Shurelya's if it is more fast-paced. This is up to you, and I want to encourage paying attention to what type of games and what type of fights you find yourself in. So I think what Riot typically does with new champions is have their numbers be overtuned initially so that more players want to play the champions. I think for this champion to be strong in solo queue, they would need to really overdo his numbers. And so personally, I probably won't be playing him, especially on my main, but I imagine in gold and below, or maybe even plat and below in more slower paced games, you can give him a go and see how he feels. There's always that advantage of enemies not necessarily knowing what his spells do or even how to play against him early on. Anyway, please let me know your thoughts down below, what you think of the champion and his identity and his abilities. For the next while, I'm going to be in Taiwan competing in the PCS playoffs with the Chiefs. Now, I'm not personally competing myself. I am a sub for their roster. I will be helping out behind the scenes however I can. But I will be gone for quite a while, maybe 2 to 3 weeks at least. And so my next video will unfortunately have to be delayed. I hope you guys understand. But that's going to be it for this Milio rundown. Thanks for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed. Big thank you to all of my Patreons over here. I really couldn't do this without you. The links for coaching, for Patreon, for my School of Support Discord server, for socials, they're all going to be linked in the description below. Any and all support is greatly appreciated. I am streaming 5 days a week now at twitch.tv/cupcakeoce. Come say hi, I would love to see you there.